All right, very good. Well, I think we are all online, and we're also online with Mark McCorcoran from the European Space Agency. Mark, how are you doing?
Good. Yeah. Hot day here. I think a little bit hotter where you are as well.
You can say it's a little warm parts. As I believe you just tweeted a few minutes ago. Not exactly off-brand for the topic we're about to begin discussing today, and it's a hugely important one as well. And I guess a reminder that in many ways, and I don't think these days we need any reminder. We're very much at the mercy of our environment, and in so many ways, I think what is happening around the world is a powerful reminder of that relationship that we perhaps need to tend to much better. Well, not perhaps, we definitely need to. And,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that's what we're about to get into today.
Yeah. I just, in that regard, I put this background up, which for many people might just, look like a piece of psychedelia, a piece of sort of cosmic art, but it's actually a picture from one of our satellites looking down on the Baltic, the sea between Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and northern Germany and Poland and so on. And this is actually an algal bloom. This is stuff that's growing in the water, and some of that is linked to fertilizers which flow out into the water from agriculture around the whole Baltic Rim. So there's so many effects that human beings are having on the planet Earth, and in fact that brings us to the title today, life in the Anthropocene. People are aware of former geological periods like the Pleistocene and the Jurassic, of course, because of dinosaurs. Why the Anthropocene? Well, this is the geological period that we believe marks or is marked in the geological record for all time to come when humans began altering their environment. So it probably didn't begin 200,000 years ago when the first humans were here. It might only have begun in 1945 when the first atomic weapons were exploded, because that leaves a trace in the geological record. So that's a lifetime. It's not much older than you and I, and we have made that much of an imprint that we've got a whole new geological era. And it's not necessarily going in a good direction either, right? So, and I think that's something we'll touch on today extensively, I think.
Indeed. Well, I mean, there's so much happening that's relevant to what we're talking about today as well. Because I mean, just this week, of course, the Perseverance, this mission to Mars, successfully launched, and it's on its way to a world that anyone who watches their sci-fi knows will be easily terraformed and made habitable by humans. Of course, we know that's a pleasing fantasy, but even a planet within our solar system that's supposedly kind of nearby in cosmic terms is radically different. And I think perhaps it highlights just how unique our world is, and just how irreplaceable it is as well.
Yeah, Mars is a very interesting geological history because it was much more like the Earth when it was young. It had liquid water, it had oceans, it had rivers and lakes. And in fact, Perseverance is going to land in a place called Jezero Crater that is known to have had a long-lived lake in the past. And the same with the ExoMars rover from ESA in a couple of years' time. We'll be going to a place where there's evidence for clays, which were laid down in water. That's deep in the past. And, when it was warm and wet, was the opportunity for life to form there on Mars at that time? And can we find traces of it today? Is it even still there under the surface somewhere? And one of the really interesting things that Perseverance is going to do is collect samples, put them into small metal canisters, and leave them on the surface for a joint NASA and ESA program called Mars Sample Return, where in a few years' time we'll go land on the surface, a little ESA rover will drive around, pick these samples up, put them in a NASA rocket, which will send them up to Mars orbit. And then an ESA orbiter will be waiting to catch the football, basically. Look, it's a round ball, and bring it back to Earth. And then we'll be able to examine those samples in far more detail than we can do with in situ labs that we have. But as you said, at best, it seems likely that Mars has microbes, perhaps. But the sort of plethora of life that we see, in our oceans, and we see in our gardens and in the forests, in the sky, that's unique to the Earth, and we really do need to think about what we're doing to that, because there is no answer going somewhere else in the solar system. This is where we were made. This is the planet we're symbiotic with.
Indeed. Well, no two better people to help us, convey that message than an artist who has spent years getting the word out by his music, and Hayley Evers-King, an ocean scientist who I guess is perhaps very special because she's a returning Uplink guest and an expert in the thing that makes our planet just so beautiful against that black backdrop. Hello, guys. Are you receiving?
Loud and clear.
Yeah, we can hear you. Hi.
Hello.
And judging from the time delay, you're all on planet Earth, so otherwise we would have to factor something in. So.
Yes, unfortunately still here.
And everyone's got funky backgrounds. I need to change my background, obviously.
Oh, you're just fine. It's all good, all good.
People are going to think I'm a Zoom noob.
No, not at all.
you just have a cooler space than we have. You really. Oh, there you go. There you go. Excellent.
Very good. Well, to the delight of everybody watching us on YouTube right now, I am sure. Well, welcome to the show. You may not have been able to hear us, but we were actually just talking about current events, not just big events. The fact that we now designated as geologic age as the Anthropocene. A time of, I guess, human-affected environmental status, which is kind of, there's something simultaneously sad and monumental about that statement. But also even more recently this week, the Perseverance has launched toward Mars, I guess helping highlight just how different the worlds in our own solar system are, and hopefully helping us come back with a really powerful message about just how unique and how special the world is. Now, Rou, I wanted to talk to you a bit about where your own fascination with outer space, with the environment began, because I mean, tracing back with the help of Hayley through so much of your music, it's something that's been there from the very beginning.
Yeah, there's no like traceable, overt influence really. I think just like most human beings, I'm just easily fascinated by the colossal nature of the universe and everything that's possible to understand or attempt to understand. And yeah, I think through music, being a sort of quite hardened atheist, not a dickhead atheist, but quite a hardened atheist, I'm very aware that the predominant subject matter for music throughout the ages has been like religious, in praise of gods of some sort. So I like to do my little bit to sort of reweigh the scales, to balance it out a bit by making music about science and about the sort of glory and the endeavor about exploration.
So, one of the subjects we're going to be talking about today is, of course, the downside, not so much of the science, but of the fact that we have impacted the Earth so much in the last 100, 200 years, pick your time. And we were talking about the Anthropocene just before you came on. And, what's the marker point for the Anthropocene? Is it 1945 and the first atomic weapons, for example, because they have left a trace in the geological record? So, there is a dystopian side to this as well. At the moment where we discover the universe, where we discover our connectedness, we discover the solar system and where life might be, we're on the edge of doing ourselves in. So, and that features in your music quite heavily as well.
Yeah. I think it's been something that we like to address, and we've always addressed, but more through the lens of the certain restraints of like our systems and our structures. That there's a real kind of conservatism, not just like in a political sense, but in like it keeps us quite static. And as humans, we find it quite hard to change and progress. And we like to know our place in the world and know the structure that we live in the society. So social redesign is something that's becomes more and more paramount the more our technology advances and our knowledge advances. We can't sort of keep the same socioeconomic system whilst we're advancing, in such huge, great leaps, especially since the sort of industrial revolution. We now have the ability to destroy ourselves in a whole plethora of ways. What we've usually looked at within our music is this kind of stagnant sort of like really cumbersome way that our change and our progress happens in these really tiny little pigeon steps, and there's a real sort of frustration in that. But yeah, that's what we try and address. And I think in the last album, it focused on, well, it's all about possibility, basically human possibility. And I think just the word possibility itself has been something that's usually quite positive. You know, anything is possible. It's like, it has all these lovely platitudes associated with it. But I think over the last kind of, well, again, like you said, you can keep going back and look at the causality of everything. But the last sort of decade, I would say, what's possible in a negative sense has really become pretty alarming.
Yeah. So let me follow up with Hayley, because we've had Hayley on the show before, and she represents many things that Alex and I are not, but one of them is being young, and she's seen in a sense more of the world change in a shorter period, over her life. I wouldn't say, of course, growing up in the 60s and 70s that things were static in those days, but the environmental movement has grown enormously recently. And one of the things which is I've always struggled with is there's kind of a Goldilocks thing with the environmental movement. Climate change is taking just long enough that we can ignore it from day to day. I mean, it's very hot today, but it'll be cooler tomorrow. Is that weather? Is that climate change? But it's nevertheless happening on a time scale which is going to affect us and our kids. It's not thousands of years in the future. It's happening now, but we're not really capable of moving fast enough. So we've asked this question before. How do the younger people, and I don't mean to put the responsibility on you, but how do you grasp this moment and seize the positive possibilities and not just the negative ones?
Yeah, I think that's really the crux of it at the moment, is this, and you were speaking about it just now, in a way that we're at this we have this juxtaposition of, we have so much knowledge that it almost seems ridiculous that we can't do something about the situation we're in. And I think there's, Rou said frustration, and frustration is exactly the right word, I think, for this. If you're fairly well informed, if you have a background like me, where you sit and you literally look at images like the one behind me constantly, and you see impacts of things that are, to a greater or lesser degree associated with climate change or other forms of environmental destruction, that frustration is huge. But at the same time, that imagery for me is utterly inspiring, that we can see that information that we have there and we can action things. You can use an image like the one behind me. This is from flooding post a typhoon in Japan. You can use that to plan like how you rescue people. And for me, that's where I try and get like sort of strength, positivity and motivation from. And space is really like a crucial thing in that. We can see the sort of limits of human endeavor being pushed all the time in the space sector, even though what we see on the ground from our space-based eyes is really depressing. So I constantly try and find empowerment from that knowledge.
I wanted to follow up on something you said, Hayley, there that was very timely in regards to a podcast I listened to with actually a friend of Mark and I, Mark Stevenson, who spends a lot of time thinking about these things. And he said that a lot of the problem isn't that we don't have the information or knowledge. It's just that we don't respond to things when we only know them intellectually. We have to feel things in order to feel triggered into action. And I suppose in many ways, perhaps that is where art and music and self-expression comes in, is bringing those things together. Not because we have to be condescending, but because we want to trigger an emotional response. We want people to feel something and not just know something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, speaking about what Rou's done in the like sort of Shikari discography, like in their more recent work, you can kind of see that this idea of knowing that information is not enough. Like there are things in terms of ignorance and our I think in Take My Country Back, you guys say about like echo chambers and stuff like that. This is such a big thing at the moment. Even if we have access to all this information, we still don't necessarily make what might seem to some of us like the obvious decisions. And that is another source of real frustration when you're a scientist, is, you look at these things, you think, this is really obvious to me, but because you don't live the same way as somebody else, around the same people, your priorities are different. It's really hard to figure out like how to affect change in both people's like hearts and minds and in practical terms. And that I think is going to be our big challenge now going forward in the Anthropocene for sure.
think one of the extra scary things about that as well is that sometimes information and knowledge even works against action, because we become like fatigued by it. I think that is obviously one of the worst things with climate change, because it's so slow, and like we can't feel it, we can't sense it, or a lot of us can't here in luckier areas of the world. But yeah, it's just something that we end up just being pushed away from, because it's almost like when the media keep talking about this possibility of catastrophe, it's like the boy who cried wolf. It's like, well, when's it coming? It's quite easy to see how people can drift into sort of that kind of either inaction or worse kind of denial, or just fatigue, or whatever it is. So it's like managing information is like really pivotal, I think, isn't it?
And I think you're absolutely right. I think there's that aspect that people get fatigued, and if they can't actually see it happening, because we confuse weather and climate very, very much. Oh, look, it snowed, and well, yeah, it's going to do that, but the baseline is moving. But I think there's the other effect, and you're interested to know how you feel about that. There's also a point of where there's existential dread kind of sets in, and you say, I actually can't do anything about this. It's not to say let's live life and burn the place down, but you kind of go into a ball and think, it's so big, and there are so many forces, whether it's just other people or corporations or governments, who are just not taking action for vested interest reasons or whatever else. It must become this enormous, I mean, I feel it. What can I actually do, right? It's very easy to fall into a funk at that point and just sort of give up. And that's not good either.
Yeah, we have a song on our recent album called Modern Living, which it kind of it introduces the concept of let me say this right, Apocalypse Anonymous, which is obviously a play on Alcoholics Anonymous, but people who are just so kind of bludgeoned with all these existential risks that we have, that we either go down a path which is just complete fanaticism and just constantly screaming all day long, or we just go into fatigue and we just feel completely helpless. And it's like a real difficulty for our mental health, I think, because we all feel the burden of the knowledge without the kind of ability to do things. But I think that there's more and more like possibilities for unity and for activism, and especially with climate change. It's almost like everyone understands, or most people in positions of powers, perhaps outside of Trump, understand what's going on. It's just kind of encouraging the global response, which seems to be the difficulty.
I mean, in many ways, we've seen that in microcosm in the last 6 months, right? I mean, we've seen scientific facts drifting, coming and going, and allowing people to say, oh, the scientists don't know what they're talking about. Well, that's not how science works. Science doesn't present a list of it's this, and this, at least, maybe with hindsight, but not in real time. And then people exploit the cracks. People jump in and use it as a way of sort of splitting us apart. And we see it. I mean, the UK in particular, I would say, in Europe, but America as well. This idea of backtracking and saying, well, I didn't say that 3 months ago, so now I'm saying this. And people in the end just sort of say, well, nothing's true, nothing's real. Let's just continue as we were. And that sort of misinformation is definitely exploited. So I think when Hayley said, we've got to be positive about it, and the fact that people don't feel things the way that I do, it's also being exploited that people don't feel the way that we do. People are deliberately being turned in certain directions, it seems. And we probably all are, right? We're all subject to advertising of some kind. None of us are immune to this whatsoever.
Indeed. Well, I mean, in some sense, certainly Mark and I, we spent a little time, mulling how to title these things. And I mean, we didn't exactly want to call this the We're All Gonna Die episode. What we're talking about here are, existential threats, just things that will potentially curtail our ability to propagate ourselves as a species, right? This is the crux of it all. In this time of COVID-19, it feels almost as if we are seeing a microcosm of the entire climate movement of the last 50 years, just like the entire thing. Awareness, a response, the sudden politicization of scientific findings, and I guess a worrying turn toward people being left to interpret things for themselves, because unfortunately many of the messages that we're getting from popular sources carry agendas, and so suddenly you have a lot of, the fact that there is a mask debate, for instance, the fact that there are so many issues surrounding COVID-19 really chimes so much with what's happened in the climate movement in the last 50 years. There's a certain point where you tune out an alarm bell, where it rings for so long that you begin to filter it out and think, well, just everything's going to be okay. Or even worse, I guess, this human proclivity toward what's, been called diffusion of responsibility. It's just this belief that, well, someone else is going to fix it. Someone else is going to call the police because they've heard a break in a few doors down, or ring the fire department. There is a burning building down the road right now. And I suppose, Hayley, you're in a unique position to have witnessed some of that change within the span of your own career.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with the pandemic, like you say, this microcosm effect has been quite striking, and it's been particularly striking in terms of like what we can observe. I mean, we've literally watched the emissions go down. You can see the sky is clearing. There's evidence of water turbidity decreasing in places where traffic has gone down. And I think this is going to be it's going to be an amazing thing to study in the times going forward. But it's also been really interesting to see how people respond to policy change. And I mean, every scientist knows that what is needed to stop climate change is not our science. It's, the science is fairly good. It's fairly well, with certain degrees of uncertainty known. It's not that's going to stop it. It's the political and social change that we need. And, the lessons we're learning about this, especially in terms of how we communicate things like uncertainty and risk, are going to be super important going forward. And I think you're right that there's this definitely a tendency of people to switch off. And I can fully understand that, because drawing on, this whole idea of like apocalypticism, pronounced correctly, I found myself early on in the pandemic just scrolling endlessly through statistics, and it reminded me of my early career, like when I was first sort of studying environmental sciences quite seriously. And there's just so much information out there, and it's so overwhelming, and you just think, oh my God, I can't actually cope with this. So I fully understand why people go, I need to take a break, because you'll drive yourself completely crazy. And mental health in this situation, both I think in terms of the longer term of any threat, if you understand climate change, I think you'll feel how that dread sits with you long term. And it's even more acute now in the pandemic. So how we deal with that part is going to be really, really crucial in the coming months and years, I think, depending on how long this situation goes on for, and then for climate change as well in the longer term.
Do you feel it on I was reading an article the other day that was talking about what it called anticipatory grief, and like anyone who's involved in the climate sciences will like feel this dread on a very real level, because you're working amongst it every day. I was like wondering, like, do you, is that like an emotional thing that you feel and you have to sort of like keep an eye on?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think you sit with this background level that is so much higher than maybe the average person. People have worries that go up and down. Maybe your kid's not doing so well at school, or you have a problem with your job, or your mortgage becomes expensive or something. And, obviously we have all that too. But in this background is this kind of simmering feeling of, what's the point if everything's, kind of slowly on this downhill with regards to climate change? And you have to be really guarded not to let that get to you. And I think people over time do develop coping mechanisms for that.
Yeah,
I think you'd have to, otherwise I think you would actually end up quite seriously ill from it. It's similar to what I guess people like medics go through on short term associated with a natural disaster or something. But this is over this very, very long time period. And like you say that, and I remember that anticipatory grief article, and I think it hits the nail on the head. It's exactly that. It's this kind of simmering sadness that you can never really escape from, but you have to try because you feel like you're compelled to do something about it.
Yeah, and for me, the problem is, again, because it's on a certain time scale, it sits with us for a long time, and it can leak through. I mean, I have two kids. One's just about to be 21, one's just about to be 19, and it's really difficult not to sort of transmit that grief to them, because in a way I mean, I hope it's not too soon, but I won't be around probably to see, I won't be around to see 2050 maybe, right? But they will, and more's the point, their kids will, and their kids will see 2100. And so the sort of the prognosis about Greenland melting and sea level rising 7 meters, right? I mean, my garden just outside here is 1 meter above sea level. This entire part of the Netherlands will be gone, right? I mean, there's no way of protecting that against 7 meters of sea level rise. So transmitting that grief, which I will feel for a world I won't be in, but they are very really going to have to live and adapt and deal with it. There's that real problem of how do I make it urgent enough without then sort of pointing the finger at them and saying, you're the ones who have to fix it because we've screwed up so badly. And that's that grief which I feel. What have I bequeathed to them, right? And me and 7 billion other people, right? That's the problem. So I was interested, Rou, you interact with your audiences, you've got a big fan base, you've been putting these messages out. I know it sounds, a bit of a leading question, but do you see an impact? Do you see that people do engage with this? I mean, Hayley's kind of a special fan, right? Because she's in the business, but do you think you are engendering conversations on this topic?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's really the major fuel that keeps me going, because this is a very different mindset from now, because now I'm longing to be on the road. But when I've been on the road for like a year, and I'm missing like my family, my friends, like all my home life, there's only so much of so many parts of being in a band that will keep you motivated. And the one that is way up above any others is when you just have those one-on-one conversations and people tell you how about music, or our music, specifically has influenced them, things as large as like career paths. Like, it's madness. And like what, subjects they're going to study at university and things. So there's a definite, reason to believe that we're fueling or invigorating things. And I think that's what I sort of see one aspect of my job as to be a sort of, not a motivator, because that's, I don't know, it sounds very egotistical and way too weird, but like a kind of, just like a provider of fuel, like fuel for activism, fuel for, I'm not really sure what it is, but like that thing that just keeps people going, that burning desire to be able to like want to change the aspects of the world that we're not happy with.
Right.
I think that's an absolutely vital role for music. I really do. I mean, like, I'll go into work some mornings and, like we're talking about that kind of existential dread feeling, and you think, why am I bothering today? Like, I'm going back, I'm working on these images, I'm looking through things, and it feels like fiddling while Rome burns, but you can, put on some good music, and that can make all the difference to trying to actually, and that's it. Like, it's I think for scientists, if you're not a musical person or you're not a creative person, I'm not particularly, I don't play any instruments myself. I'm not particularly artistic as I would consider traditionally. So I often look to music particularly for that kind of, as you say, motivation. Something just needs to give you a bit of a kick to get going in the morning. And, a bit of high tempo music that says, come on, get up, fight this, you've got to carry on, is really what you need in many situations, not just in regards to these types of existential dread. So I think that's where that crossover lies really strongly.
Yeah, music as well is, since the onset of our species, music has been something that's brought us together. So it reminds us of our shared fate, our shared vulnerability, the fact that we're one family on one planet. It's a good tool to remind you of like how we're all in this together, and reminds us of our connectedness.
Yeah, I think science is like that too. I think people know as scientists, when you do research, you are very acutely aware that your work builds upon this long history, stretching back to kind of the great philosophers and everything. And there's a sense of unity and community that comes from that as well, knowing that you are this one little piece of the puzzle. And, I think space is really amazing for bringing that together. You watch a launch, you watch a mission project kind of go off, and all these little people working all over the world half the time, to make something happen, that makes you think, maybe we can solve some of these problems, like maybe we have a chance. So that's another source of inspiration, and same sort of feeling as I get from listening to good music or having chats with fellow fans, bands and things.
I wonder, and I would never say that there's a silver lining to be taken from this, but we've touched on this on previous uplinks and Mark and my conversations, that one of the most dangerous things in all of this is people having this unshakable feeling of their own futility, that there's nothing that they can do to affect change. But there is something that's happened during this time of COVID-19, of course, right? We have seen, if we make certain decisions, I mean, they may have calamitous economic effect and so on. If we really need to, we can almost immediately affect the environment, which, at least from what I've seen, has come as a surprise to everyone, that we can actually have such an immediate effect on our atmosphere and so on. So in a way, I think there's actually something hopeful about that, because it means that we can make a positive change if we have the will to do so. At a policy level, at a community level, we can make these changes, and we can see those changes begin in our own lifetimes. And so, I mean, Hayley, I wondered if you could help illustrate some of that, because I mean, I've been startled by some of the images, because of course ESA's Earth observation mission provides so many of the images that have actually shown these pinpoints, like over Milan and elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we've been able to see the air quality is probably one of the most striking examples of this. We can literally see that those emissions have gone down, and it's amazing to know that that is actually possible. The same with some of the recovery of some of the coastal water quality and things like that. So we can see very clearly that this can be done. Obviously we have to figure out how to trade that off against the costs that have been borne at the moment, and that's something we can't forget as well. It's really easy, I think, when you study the environment, to think about the environment first, and of course it's not the environment, it's also people. And I certainly do care deeply about making sure that people are able to continue doing what they do. And we are able to help that with the space sector, because one of the good things, if you can't get out of the house and you can't go and monitor a thing you need to do for your job, you can potentially do it with a satellite. So you can be part of this system that adapts. And I've seen a lot of innovation in the space sector at this time. And I mean, the same, I'm sure Rou can give some examples as well of the music sector, how people have really adapted to try and, by necessity in this case, never waste a good crisis, but we've adapted to things that are good and that we will keep long term. I mean, within my work, so a lot of what I do is training people, like new generations of scientists, local governments, policymakers, people to use the sorts of data that we produce. And we've long had a kind of goal that we would move more of this online, to reduce our travel budgets and our travel emissions, to make things more equitable for people around the world to access that information. And we were forced to do it by, COVID. And we've learned a huge amount very quickly about how to do that more effectively. And we will keep doing that now, so that's a real positive thing that's come out of it. And I think, I still hope we all get to go to gigs, because I'm really missing gigs. And I'm gutted the Shikari gig in November at Offenbach has had to move, but I'll see you guys in May. So, there are certain things I think we will still be doing as we've done, hopefully, but there's a lot we've learned that we can take forward that's really positive from this.
I think one of the things that comes out of this as well is also that it's a little bit like pouring acid onto a metal. We're etching the situation. We're not accepting that it's the same as it was. So we're kind of looking at things in more detail than we have before. In a way, as a metaphor, I think so many more people would become vegetarian if they actually saw how meat was produced, right? I mean, we've managed to hide it behind the barriers whereby meat means buying a piece of white plastic with cling film on the top of it and sticking it in the pan and eating it. We don't actually see what meat means. And we haven't, there's so many aspects of modern society that are just completely hidden from us. I mean, another example is the fact that, fish caught in the North Sea is actually shipped all the way to China to be gutted and filleted and then comes back to Europe again. I mean, and the climate change, hit of that piece of fish that you've eaten is enormous, but actually it's profitable to do it if you're not accounting for the climate change aspect. Purely financially, it's cheaper to have it in China and filleted than do it in Europe. And I think we've begun to see this also, to politicize things. We've begun to see this with the way that governments have handled or not handled the pandemic, or the way that governments have handled or not handled things like Brexit, for example. It's exposing systems which we've taken for granted for so long because they've been hidden from us. And suddenly you think, what the hell are Henry VIII powers, right? How on earth does Henry VIII have anything to do with our modern society and the way government works? Well, it's just how it is in the UK. So again, Rou, you're somebody who obviously reads very extensively and is intensely aware of the world around you. Have you found that not being on the road, not being able to do what your normal job has made you think much more about the environment that you live in, the world you live in, the place, the way the world works?
I think I'm probably quite lucky in what I do, in the fact that I have a lot of spare time. Because I am always traveling, which is one of the obvious kind of hypocritical aspects of my job. When I'm on tour, I'm always on a plane, and we try and do the best we can in terms of taking trains where possible and public transport. And I do everything I can in my own life. But I think I have a lot of time, I guess is what I'm saying. So I'm always trying to think about the bigger picture. And I think that's what another sort of a way that, or something that I try and do with our music is introduce or reintroduce the bigger picture to people, big history and perspective, basically, because our lives are usually so kind of blinkered and so repetitive and routine that having those moments of, you could call it escapism, but it's not really, because it's more real, I think, to some extent, than a lot of our day-to-day lives. Reintroducing the bigger concepts, be it of kind of our introducing social unity, or talking about climate change, or the various existential risks that we talk about on our latest album, Nuclear War, and everything else. But bringing these concepts to the forefront of their minds again, because I think it sounds a little counterintuitive, especially with the existential risk stuff, but I think it can do wonders for our kind of, I don't know what the word would be, but our sort of knowing our place in the world, and knowing that we're this tiny thing, but we're part of something so much bigger, and there's so much we can do if we come together, and all these kind of slightly cliched concepts. But that's just another sort of aspect of the job as far as I think about it.
I think that's been one of the hardest things about the pandemic for me, is really losing a lot of perspective being the kind of key word here, just from where you would normally get it, from talking to different people, from, just going out and getting the vibe of a place or a concert, in particular, all of that has kind of disappeared. I find I've had much more meaningful conversations online than I've ever had. Which is, has been great. And especially as somebody, who lives far away from a lot of my family and friends, it's nice that we can do that. But it's so easy to lose that perspective. It's one thing I like about the work we do, because we have literally got a huge perspective of what's going on the planet. And that's a thing that keeps me motivated coming back to that. But I think we've had to find new ways to try and find it in the pandemic. And music is one way, science and space is another. I've really enjoyed watching the two, I guess, really seriously major launches that have happened during the pandemic time, with the SpaceX, and then with Perseverance this week. Brings me back to kind of some sense of normality, which for me has always been that big perspective. I feel comfortable and comforted when I feel okay, I've got a big picture, I know what's going on. And the pandemic has really threatened, I think, to rip that from us quite badly.
Yeah, I think just to pick up on that, of course, in recent weeks, we're seeing the United Arab Emirates, and we're seeing China going to Mars as well. Space in that sense has become very different from this geopolitical battle. You often hear this phrase, the new space race. And it just isn't one. I mean, okay, maybe certain politicians try to exploit it that way because they're embedded in old school politics. But what we do, I mean, and certainly what you do at EUMETSAT and what we do at ESA is by necessity international. It's all the countries around Europe. But we collaborate. There are French science experiments on perseverance. There's European stuff on the stuff. We're providing communications capability to the Chinese mission. So that's also quite symbolic, that the kind of the Soviet Union versus the United States picture, which was so prevalent at the beginning of the space age. The media love to dredge it up and say, oh, aren't we in another race? Because they're kind of addicted to this idea of opposites and balance. And it's just not like that in our business. So every interview I've done on this, people say, are we in a new space race? It's like, no, we're collaborating, we're cooperating. It's just not how it works. Yeah, I mean, you want to, it's called co-opetition, might be the thing where you're cooperating and competing at the same time. But you want to be first, you don't want to be left behind. But if you can do it with your friends, all the better, really.
I think that that's one of the best things about art, in its broadest sense, and science in its broadest sense, is that we live in a different sort of world framework where, global cooperation is completely normal. Whereas, in the kind of business world or, other aspects of the world, it's all about the way our socio-economic system has pummeled us with its competition, its short-term profit, it's everyone against everyone else, which is, part of the reason why we're in this bigger mess.
Yeah. So let me bring up something, because long-time listeners will know that I have a certain take on this. You mentioned SpaceX. Of course, you were talking about the fact, Hayley, that they had launched 2 astronauts. The United States has its own launch capability again. The other news yesterday, that's linked in a sense to SpaceX, is that Amazon have got approval now to fly their own mega constellation of low Earth orbit communication satellites, 3,500 or so, in Project Kuiper. And so that's another thing which I think is it's not linked to the pandemic, although in fact partly it is, because the skies were so clear in the early part of the year, people were able to go out and see these Starlink satellites from SpaceX fly past. I think that's been quite symbolic, and I wonder if you're aware of it, Rou, that the kind of the night sky is disappearing in return for a few milliseconds of reduced latency on your broadband. And who has asked us, right? I mean, this is one country making these rules for this to happen, 5% of the Earth's population. But what about the rest of us? And I wonder if that's symbolic for how politics needs to change. You've alluded it to a couple of times. We need a change in the socio-economic system, without wanting to sound like sixth form Marxists. How do we do that exactly?
Hayley, do you I don't want to take that one.
No, it's a really difficult one. I think so space has kind of been suitably far away, but maybe it's not suffered yet in the same way that a lot of our sort of resources have on Earth. One of the first things, and this is kind of going back, I guess, to a bit of sixth form kind of Marxism, as you say, but one of the things I learned about early on as an environmental science student was the idea of the tragedy of the commons and how we manage resources and what do you do with that kind of thing. And I think this is now what we're seeing a bit with space. It is becoming much more in demand because it has benefits for society, which is great, but how do we manage that resource? It's the same with the oceans, the same with the fisheries. How do we sustainably do this? It's really hard. I think it can be done, but as Rou was saying earlier, there's a systemic level change in what we value that needs to happen in order for that. More value on time and more cost on, or proper valuation of cost of what our activities actually do. It's not enough just to say this is what something is worth to people. You have to say, what is it taking away from the future? And that kind of idea of ecosystem services, or actually putting money values on our natural environment, it feels a bit distasteful, because we love the natural environment, it's beautiful as it is, but I think that sort of thing might actually help us to understand and incorporate that into the system a bit more. These kind of ideas of triple bottom line approaches for economics and stuff. This is taking me way back to my undergraduate days, but I think we've got to kind of go that way. Or at least that's the way I can maybe see us going, without completely flattening everything, because I think that would probably come with its own problems as well. I don't have all the answers, unfortunately. Yeah. We'll work on some.
Well, I wonder if just to not to go too far into the world of science fiction, of course, but I you know, I kind of tend to think that pretty much all issues of social and environmental justice relate to our ability, or maybe our inability, to see ourselves as one species. You know, and you know, when it comes to the climate movement and environmentalism, I mean, I know Mark and I have talked about this before. So much of it is to do with the overview effect. You know, pictures like Earthrise that showed the Earth against the black backdrop of space, that they just immediately conveyed a sense of the Earth's fragility. You know, just how small we are in the cosmos. To me, that's always been the underlying importance of so much space exploration. It's not just the science, but also just what it does to our sense of scale and our importance. Because I guess the biggest problem we've always had, and you know, beyond sixth form Marxism, perhaps not wanting to dismantle religious systems at the same time, you know, is getting away from this idea that we are at the center of the universe, and that it's our destiny to conquer everything around us. You know, to see ourselves as part of a symbiotic relationship with our environment, that's a real affront to a lot of the ideas that we've inherited for generations. And so I put it to the group, what are your thoughts there on Gene Roddenberry's vision of our need to perhaps see ourselves as just one humanity?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely vital. I mean, I don't think you can get away from it. It always comes back down to this, right? Any form of inequality is perpetuated by these differences that we see and that we place, and where we, you know, who controls what particular bit of land, and what do you charge there for a certain unit of work versus in another, and you know, what do you sell somewhere cheaper for to another person? You know, it perpetuates these kind of inequalities. And because there's this constant need for competition between people, it's often difficult for us to step back and see what the wider impacts of those choices are. I mean, COVID has brought this into sharp relief, right? The mask debate is really brings this, it's really clear, as a really clear example. You know, you genuinely are doing something mostly for other people, and there's an element of selfishness in there. It's more complicated, I think, with wider environmental issues, because people have competing things that they need to take care of. You know, it's hard to say I'll choose a more environmentally friendly food option when something is cheaper and you've got 3 kids to feed. So, you know, it becomes much more complex. But I think those trade-offs are what we have to wrestle with, and fundamentally a mind shift towards every action that I take, every choice that I make has impacts not just beyond me, but I also value those impacts semi-equally, I guess, at least.
Very well said. And Rou, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think my major qualm is with the lack of conversation. So we have this system which has, you know, it's been updated through the centuries, but you know, it's feudalism, it's capitalism, it's market economics, it's, you know, whatever you want to call it. And now it's kind of got this interesting tinge of neoliberalism, which is, well, we haven't got time to go into the heart of that, but there's this interesting revival of nationalism, and provincialism, I think, is probably a better way of describing it, because it's like, it's retreating back behind your borders, caring about yourself and ignoring everyone else, or, you know, even blaming your problems on everyone else. And it's a completely ridiculous view of the world in 2020, because all of our problems are global. So we need to have the conversation, but there's this kind of mantra, I think now, whether it's actually recited or not, but we have a track on the album called Tina, Tina, which is there is no alternative. And it's like, even these conversations where like we ourselves as sort of progressively minded people will take the mick out of like Marxism or sixth form politics or whatever, is because we're sort of almost trained that, we want to avoid the conversation. Even, you know, any aspect of like, can't we do things differently? Oh, shut up! What are you, a communist? Like it's a really interesting like emotional reaction, and I think we have to find a way to have the conversation, and it needs to be patient and calm, because at the moment, obviously, we all know, especially on social media, but in the real world as well, like there is a degree of, what would we call it? uncivility, maybe, where we're constantly outraged. There's social distrust has been climbing for decades, and again, I think it's another example of where we've had these advances in technology, social media technologies, that have connected us, and they've been kind of brought to us in a very positive light. This brings us closer together, and yeah, of course, there's amazing aspects of it, but there's a lot of like second order effects that we didn't really realize, which are now kind of coming to light and producing us to be very cautious about everyone else and very cautious about any new ideas, and that's obviously really dangerous. So we have to not only have the conversations about the wider economic system, we have to have the conversations about the way we interact. We have to have a conversation about communication. So this is the whole idea of trying to get people to think in a bigger perspective, because we have to have some big conversations if we're gonna get anywhere, I think.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's interesting because I guess what we're talking about is just like, what's the catalyst going to be? Because we have so much information out there about what's going on. Will it be that just bringing our audience into the conversation for a minute? And thank you very much to everyone who's been hanging out with us for the last 48 minutes or so. Heidi asks, and I think it's actually pertinent to a question about current missions to Mars, for instance. If we were to identify life on another planet or moon, would it change our attitudes about ourselves and maybe climate change? You know, a question for the group. I think it's a great one.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, I would hope so. You know, I would hope that it would be a moment like that Earthrise photo, you know, where we were able to look back and go, we're just not that unique. We're just not that special. Like, there are other ways of doing things. And I would hope that might be what other life might show us. I think it would definitely change how we feel. I mean, it certainly would for me. I mean, it's one of the things I absolutely hope for in my lifetime is that we find some kind of, like, even tiny, you know, microbial, which will probably be the most likely thing. Like, if we find that, I will die happy. So let's keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, to pick up on that a little bit, my slight concern about the Earthrise picture and so on, it's a metaphor for the fact that, you know, some fraction of the population will take their solace or their philosophical meaning from one thing, and others just won't. I mean, you know, other people will be saying, I can't eat that picture of the Earth from space. I can't, you know, and
that's fair.
We know, you know, the Apollo program, there were protests, of course, at the time where, you know, this great moment of triumph for humankind, as it was posited. Gil Scott-Heron and his famous song, you know, Whitey's on the Moon, right? I mean, at that point where racial injustice was just as much an issue in the United States as it still is today. So I think we have to be very careful that we don't lock ourselves in another bubble. I mean, we get ourselves out of one bubble and we end up in another one, which is slightly bigger, but nothing like big enough. I mean, it's something I'm constantly struggling with in what we do in sort of outreach and communication from the European Space Agency is the numbers have gone up. We slap ourselves on the back. Look at all the people who, you know, like this on Twitter or followed us on Facebook and so on. You think, well, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the entirety of the population. And even if it's everybody for a day, they'll go on to something else tomorrow. So I think we can fool ourselves about that perspective. So I actually, in a weird way, even though we're building missions to do this, to find life elsewhere, I'm not sure it would make a difference unless they actually all turned up in Vogon spaceships and said they were going to take, you know, bulldoze the planet. I mean, at which point everybody feels an existential reason to act. I think it may just be another thing. Oh, how much money did we spend on finding a microbe on Mars? What was the point of that? So I think we have to find a meaning in another way. Purely philosophically, it will mean something to a fraction of the population, but maybe not enough.
Yeah, it's almost more intense if we don't, well, it's probably more likely, I don't know as well, if we don't find life in our solar system or, you know, be it on our other means outside of our solar system. Because then it's like, we're the only form of intelligent life, like in, well,
it's a lot of pressure.
System, you know, and we just keep going out and out, and it's like, damn, well, we've got to get ourselves on a better track, don't we?
So you've written about that. We talked about it in some of the emails we exchanged in advance. Again, to some people, it seems like a purely science fiction question, but there is a really strong philosophical underpinning to this question, the Fermi paradox. Are we alone? You know, and if we are, why are we? Is it because we uniquely formed, or is it because species kill themselves off pretty much after they you know, develop the technology to recognize that they're alone? You know, where do you see that? Because I'm intrigued by that point. You know, if we don't find it in the solar system, it gets, it kind of raises the ante, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we have like, if we got like a single message, just like one single message, like even in like a rudimentary form from outside space, and it like proved that there's some civilization somewhere transmitting a message, that would tell us that there is a species somewhere that has done it. They've survived this point in any intelligent species lifespan that comes where you make technology that would enable your own destruction. So be that nuclear weapons or be that the technologies that contribute to climate change, and you overcome them and you don't kill yourself. So so finding that one message would prove that like we can do it. We can get through this as well. This point, like Toby Ord has just released a book called The Precipice, which is incredible. So that's what he calls it. Like in our last album, we call it the Great Unknown, because it's this kind of turning point where like, okay, now, as you know, I think Carl Sagan first like posited it, like, does a species destroy itself, or does it conquer that kind of that hostility, that interspecies, or you know, just in your own species hostility, with the fact that you've got intense technologies.
You really are going to enjoy reading the Three Body Problem books when you get, you know, because I won't give it away. Other people we've talked about it before. There is another reason why we may not be hearing from civilizations, because, well, again, without giving it, because they might be scared, right? And there might be a reason to be, if you consider the larger picture. So read the books, because for me it wasn't an eye-opener. Yes, I mean, it's another hypothesis about the Fermi paradox, but it's a very clever one. And
I think kind of what you're talking about here is a bit of like, it's about self-awareness, right? I mean, to survive to survive this point where, you know, you're capable of destroying yourself, you have to be really aware of what you're doing. And I think that's what we're grappling with now, both at a societal level and at an individual level. You know, we haven't really reached that level of maturity yet where we really are able to go, this is what we're doing, this is the actual impact of our actions necessarily, as a unit and as individuals. You know, as we said, we're all subject to these biases. Like, we immediately think, oh yeah, we could solve these problems. And that's,
I wonder if in part that is because it's been so rapid, right? I mean, even 2,000 years on the timescale of 200,000 years is really rapid, but the incredible growth rate in technology in just 100 years, right? And our brains just, and our systems and our societies are just not keeping up with this rate of change. You know, I mean, I don't want to be an Elon Musk catastrophist, you know, who's too worried about AI taking over the world. But, you know, some of these things we are inventing stuff at such a high speed. Our systems are clearly not capable of taking them into account, because we sort of proceed in other ways on timescales which are far too slow to regulate and to check and cross-check. And we've seen that with genetic modification, of course. I mean, that's sort of barely under control. And go ahead, Alex.
Please, no, I'm sorry. I'm just following on for that, Mark. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but it really chimes with something that Roman, who's been watching, says. And to paraphrase, isn't it ironic that it seems that we are in this time of incredible discovery and innovation, and yet we are simultaneously seeing the rise of nationalism and so many things that seem to be this really depressing counterpoint to, you know, to what we actually are now discovering. I mean, because, you know, this is a remarkable time of advancement in so many different fields, and yet, you know, it seems like we're regressing in so many ways. You know, it's a bitter moment in human history because there's so much wonder, and yet there is also just so much disappointment as well, just in the way that people are behaving toward one another.
I wonder if people felt this, like, you know, we talked about the space race just now. Like, I wonder if people felt similarly, like, you know, in the like late 60s and stuff, because there was, you know, there was a huge existential kind of dread feeling there with the advent of kind of nuclear weaponry and things like that. But it was accompanied all by this incredible space technology, which has, you know, over the next how many years permeated into our society and done huge good, which is why, you know, I always feel like, as we were talking earlier, that kind of you think, oh, is this really the right way to be spending money? But then you remember actually what the impacts a lot of this technology has ultimately had on medicine, on transport, on communications, etc. You don't feel so bad. But I wonder if they felt the same then, and if there are things we can kind of learn a bit from that. Like, I mean, we got through that in a way. We didn't yet, fingers crossed, bomb ourselves all to oblivion.
Yeah, we came pretty close, right? Came close at a couple of moments.
Yeah. So I don't know, we're maybe fumbling through sort of space and time of it as a society, but we are undoubtedly learning things, I think, about how we manage that. I hope so. Maybe I'm a bit of an optimist.
And Rou?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think obviously we're making progress, but it's just, yeah, the age-old question of whether we'll make the progress in our morality, our civility, our sort of just general wisdom that will be fast enough as the progress we're making in our technologies, and obviously particularly our destructive technologies. That will be the great question.
I'm personally, I'm actually not, maybe it's 2020 hindsight, but I'm not as surprised as some people seem to be that at this time of great advances and the opening up of the ability to communicate freely as we're doing now across the world. I mean, just, what was it like before we had mobile phones, right? I mean, you can postulate them as bad things because you might be wasting your time playing a game on them all the time. But on the other hand, they mean you can be safer, you can communicate, you can be in contact with, you can share ideas. And I guess my concern slightly is that this is taking away a model of which relies on inequality by definition, right? You don't have something that somebody else has. And that might be pulling upwards. I want to have the stuff that you have so I can be at the top of the pile, or you want to rise up the pile. So creating a sense of inequality to sell things to us, to keep the machine going, it doesn't surprise me at all in a way that we're there. And at the same time, as we're beginning to see these existential risks, or they're becoming clearer, people are going to start entrenching and saying, well, don't talk to each other about how to solve these problems because that takes my business case away. So I'm actually not surprised that nationalism and provincialism, as you put it, Rou, have come in at this time, because entrenched models of society and business are very scared in some ways about how we might have to change in order to solve the problems that are coming. I mean, I was sort of taken earlier on by the point that, I started it by saying sixth form Marxism. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with Marxism in my book. I mean, it's something we should examine and look at and tension against all of the other possible ways of running society. But it's definitely the case that we have one of the primary good things that our society relies on, and something we're extremely good at, is advertising. And convincing people of a certain mindset, of a want, a need, a desire, a want for something they don't have. And so we have been, at some level, I think, brainwashed into saying our system is the best system because, of course, the advertising has told us that it has, that it is, because it wouldn't survive without it. I mean, now that all sounds very conspiratorial, but we're very easy to point, and we see it from America. You can't even mention socialism. That's a bad thing. In Europe, we're allowed to say socialism, but not communism. So I think that it's the hardest thing is how do you step outside of your own advertised, propagandized zone and see the way other people, and that's really something, China is going to put us on the spot with, right? Completely. Because the way the Chinese system works is actually quite different to the way it works in the West. It's capitalism with communism, with repression, with control. I mean, have the band toured in China? Rou, have you seen that?
We've done one show in China. I can't remember. It wasn't a major city as well. It was somewhere on the south coast. It was like an industrial city. And we had a very interesting time there, but we were only there for like kind of 48 hours really. So I can't say I've had much experience of the country at all, because it is quite hard to play. You have to submit all your lyrics and everything. Every aspect of your performance has to be checked over and everything. So obviously for a band like ours, it is quite difficult, but we managed to do it. but yeah, whether we have a sort of career there, I don't think that's going to.
But you will have seen, of course, that immediate. If it depends when it was, but Twitter, it doesn't work, right? Google doesn't work. The things you sort of take for granted as being, how do I inform myself? They don't work.
It was a much bigger like culture shock than Japan, because not only is everything written in a completely different alphabet, and you're just like where am I? What is this? But then you look to your phone, you look to Twitter, you look to Google, and you're like and it's doubly as kind of shocking. But yeah, interesting.
Well, we like to kind of like mash different areas together. It's a quote that's frequently attributed to Gandhi. It was actually a Nobel laureate for literature named Pearl Buck, who wrote a book called My Several Worlds, and she wrote about peasant life in China. It was she who said, judges society by how it treats its weakest members. And I suppose that's the lesson that we can take from many times in human history. Was it wasn't the great invention that defined a time. It was who was oppressed and how the weak in our society was treated. And I think that's what the standard by which we have to continue to measure ourselves, no matter how much is going on in the world of science and innovation. I guess it's a bitter irony now. Hayley, you said something really important before, and I kind of remarked on this myself, during the recent Crew Dragon launch, that happened. That was the same weekend that the Black Lives Matters protests erupted throughout the States. And it just seemed like this just a horrific disparity in visions, like you're watching a lot of really tone deaf coverage about, just like what this means, for the nation and all this. And there's no taking away what that achievement signifies. And yet this horrific act had taken place, and this whole people, just like erupted in I think very justifiable anger, and speaking of 50 years ago, the birth of hip hop is attributed to Gil Scott-Heron, who, he did a song called Whitey's on the Moon, just as Apollo was going up, he was saying, and yet, my family can't feed itself, and so, it's like we see these parallels repeating themselves over and over again. And it's interesting, how I think until we have a holistic view of what humans are doing, not just the cutting edge, but also just like the sort of like the sad aspects that need to be addressed as well. I don't think we're ever really going to move forward, are we?
I think you make a really good point there, and it was something I was thinking about earlier. And I know it's something that musicians get asked a lot, and scientists get told the same thing: is keep the politics out of it. And it's almost impossible to do that. You're right, especially in science, it's impossible. Like the missions we choose to launch are political decisions. At the end of the day, they have political ramifications. Especially if we're spending money that is part of a budget that needs to be spent across all of our society. And I think if we ever lose sight of that, it's a really bad thing. I mean, I feel quite lucky, and to a degree it's chosen that way. The sector that I work in, Earth observation, I'm inspired by it and pushed to do it because I think it is beneficial to us, to people. And I hope it can help, it can do things that make lives better. It can help feed more people. It can keep water cleaner so people don't get these horrendous, illnesses that they can get when water quality is bad. So I feel fairly secure that I'm choosing to do something that's quite a good idea, but I hope I never lose that ability to reflect. And I think we all have to have that, in all aspects of our lives. So you cannot separate these two aspects. The personal is political, and everything is when it comes down to it.
Even the practice of science is political, it's cultural, it comes from a context. This idea that science is neutral, science is just science, I think, that's a pretty childish way of maybe, even Newton's laws or calculus, the fight between Leibniz and Newton. I mean, there was a politics, there was a debate. Okay, it's not an injustice subject that where we see that today, where the entrenched power systems, science gets defined by funding. Bluntly, nobody can do science without money these days, and it comes from the taxpayer, and that money can be directed in different ways. Let me change topic though, because I am, I'm going to put Rou back on the spot again. So how much, on the basis that at some point you will hopefully go back out touring and get back on the road, what have you been thinking about in terms of how to do that differently? And I don't just mean, keeping your audiences safe from coronavirus, but also with climate change, you mentioned earlier on, right? I mean, you're on planes all the time. How does the music industry reset itself at this point? How does it, because, you know, I know, you know, you don't make money necessarily out of records. The touring can be a very important aspect of that. How does the music business, you know, remain relevant, but you know, able to make a living for people as well, right? I mean, there's a business side to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough one, that because the primary income is through touring by quite a long way. I mean, unless you're a band that does a lot of merchandise, touring is your only means of making a living. Unless you're doing crazy numbers on Spotify or whatever. So I think that first and foremost is you have to look at the industries that you're using that are contributing to climate change. So we have to do everything in our power in terms of activism with travel industries, basically. Now, we've been lucky. We've had a few examples. So in America, we did a few tours using a small touring van that ran on basically chip fat, like chip oil. And that was amazing. Like there's actually a small kind of industry there that is really good, and that they haven't gone up to sort of big tour buses, so you know it's not right for every level of the industry. I just
have this image of you stopping off at McDonald's in every city you're going across the United States. Can we have some of the drained off?
Yeah, just thoroughly bored of chips for dinner. Yeah. But that's pretty much a norm anyway for me in America, when being a sort of a borderline vegan. Oh, chips and salad then, I suppose, is my only but yeah, no, I think that you know there's lots of stuff that we can do that we've thought about a lot in terms of our production and our lighting. The industry again is coming along, you know, in those small steps. Like even just like LED lighting is just like such a bigger forward step for progress, rather than, you know, par cans and things like these old school lights that just emit so much heat for one on stage, so you're sweating, but are also, you know, terrible for the environment. So it's yeah, there's all these like little aspects that we can do, and I think that's all that kind of stuff should be looked at. I think music venues, the one thing that they have to do is recycle. Like it's insane the amount of venues that we play that don't recycle, and you think of the glass and the plastic that they use, so that has to be like put into law. But I think the real pushes have to be in terms of the contributing industries. So, you know, where we get our energy from and how we transport ourselves as human beings around this planet. Those are the industries that we have to concentrate on. I think to some extent, the kind of smaller things that we can all do as individuals or as bands or groups, whatever, organizations, they matter, but we shouldn't let that kind of eclipse the real, you know, the real work and the real progress is going to come from when we keep the millions of barrels of oil in the ground. Like that's when we can say, okay, we are making actual progress now.
Yeah, I think that there is that issue, isn't there? That we often are put upon, you know, blamed as individuals for actions which are not necessarily the sum of the individuals, but there are substrata in society which are just doing things anyway. I mean, this is one of the things that's been talked about a lot in terms of environmentalism in the last few years, is, you know, making the individual feel guilty. Yes, we all have a role to play, but the system, you know, even if we removed all the human beings from it, it would still keep doing certain things, it seems. And finding that balance, I think that's really good perspective, because I know many, you know, Coldplay went out and said, we're not going to tour until we can do it carbon neutral. It's like, well, you probably got a bit of cash in the bank as well at the moment, right? So you can probably afford to do that. Whereas smaller bands, you know, they either live or, as you said, live or die on touring. We just may be musically poorer if, well, I probably shouldn't say this, if the only band we have to listen to is them. Anyway.
Very good. Well, a couple of more questions. You know, we've got some great conversations happening, certainly. Well, this one comes from James, you know, and I suppose, you know, one for the group, I think, you know, Hayley might have some thoughts for sure. You know, space is such a great mystery, but, you know, don't the Earth's oceans pose even more mysteries to us? You know, don't we have so much more to learn from things much closer to home?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, this comparison is often made between, you know, that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the deep oceans. And to an extent, it's true. You know, the oceans are absolutely vast and they're very unexplored, especially the depths of them. So there's a lot to learn from that. And a lot of it is very useful information as well. So like, you know, we talked earlier about this idea of exploration feeling like a bit of a waste of cash. But I mean, in terms of what's in the deep ocean that might actually be really interesting and useful for us, you know, there are creatures there that have lived entirely separate from sunlight, their entire like evolutionary history. Like the energy production methodology that they employ is completely foreign to us on the surface pretty much. So there's a lot to learn there in terms of like chemical processes that we might use for things like renewable energy. You know, there's compounds there that may be useful for medicine. You know, I don't like to talk about the environment purely in terms of exploitation, but if we're talking about balancing this need to understand and protect with what it actually valuably can mean for us, like the deep ocean is one really clear example of that. I mean, with satellites, we can see more of the ocean than ever. And, you know, I think it's important that we keep maintaining that. We've got new missions coming up that will, you know, continue to measure things like sea level, that continue to measure things like the biology that are going on in the surface of the ocean. So we do know now more about it than we ever have before, but it's because it's such a key part of this climate cycles and climate change, you know, story, the oceans, we need to be able to keep doing that. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to see really what's in store for us via the oceans. It's a great question.
How do we tension that, you know, because this is much more in your domain than mine, how do we tension that against the fact that there are other resources there which are more linked to, you know, the industrial base, you know, the nodules of manganese and so deep sea mining and strip mining, and this is, you know, this is not far away now. I mean, people have begun to develop the machinery to just basically hoover this material up. You know, what's the regulation framework? It's often asked about the moon, you know, for space, who owns the moon? There is the Outer Space Treaty. What is the situation with respect to the deep sea, the deep ocean floor?
I mean, it throws back to that kind of tragedy of the commons stuff we were talking about earlier, and that the open ocean and the deep oceans, you know, underneath them are kind of in a free-for-all in some ways. You know, we have the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, as you hear it called, so we have some level of control, and you know, countries have legislation that covers the, you know, their own economic zone, their continental shelves and things like that. But it's a battleground. It's something that's being fought over. I mean, there are examples of people, countries, you know, looking where the ice is melting in the Arctic and Antarctic to see if they can claim things. These are battles that are going to be fought, and we will need, you know, public support, public consideration, and like the public to be relatively well informed to try and push for change or prevent these things happening. So, you know, I think it's something for us all to kind of keep an eye on in the coming years, and, you know, use our votes and protest power accordingly to, you know, create the kind of future for the oceans that we want.
Good. And we have a final question for Rou. Actually, an artist named Jack Johnson asks Charlie, did a tour where he actually had his fans collect all the rubbish after the concert. For instance, do you think you would consider you know, trying things like that, almost literally just because I think, you know, from the bottom up, grassroots, sometimes things really do have a beautiful peripheral effect. Is that something that you would consider doing?
That's amazing. Was that like as a form of like how they get a ticket, or was that just they just had to do it as like a it was in the terms and conditions?
I don't know the transaction. Maybe he has a cleaning up song at the end, you know, that they play.
So brilliant.
Yes, indeed.
I feel like Shikari fans would do that. I feel like they would probably get on board. Like, you could ask him to do that.
Well, yeah, hopefully it's like something that you shouldn't really need to stipulate, should you? Like it's horrible seeing all, you know, it got a bit trite in the media, but like seeing all the pictures of beaches and everything else that have just been covered in litter, and it's just like, who are these people? Like, what? How? Yeah, so it's frustrating. But yeah, I'm not sure what we'd we've done things like food drives and stuff, which has been in like clothes drives, you know, like food banks and clothes banks, populating them as shows. That's been like quite fun and quite interesting. And I think a lot of the time people are more than happy to like be involved, because it's like a lot of the time we're all so busy in our lives, and if you get someone coming to your show and then just say, oh, and by the way, you can do this, and it's like, oh yeah, I've been meaning to do something like that, and it's just an excuse. So the more we can have the default setting to include those extras, the better. It's the same way in, like, you know, donating your organs to science. If that's the default setting when you get your passport or your driver's license or whatever it is, then people will just go, yeah, cool. But if you have to tick a box to say, no, I don't want that, then they'll like, you know, it just changes the way we think about things. But I think the more we make those positive aspects the default, the better.
Yeah, I think you've picked up on something really important there. It's that creating an environment where people don't go to the beach and say, well, I'm just leaving one Coke can here, you know, and the fact there's 5,000 other people doing the same thing, that people do think a little bit, you know, peripherally and think, well, if I'm not doing this, other people won't do it as well. And it's, you know, we briefly touched on the mask thing and other forms of public behavior, where it's kind of, you know, this is what you do. You sign up to organ donation. You do put the litter in the bin, but if you see other people not doing it, it's a very rapid runaway effect where you say, well, they're trashing my environment, so why should I care? Well, I'm just going to throw my thing on the floor as well. And somehow it seems we've lost that a little bit, you know. Maybe it's the fear, maybe it's the fact, well, it doesn't matter anyway, Rome's burning. So bringing back the positivity and saying, well, actually, if we do this stuff together. I mean, I was thinking about, you know, at the end of your gig, that would be the time to do it, right? If anything, if you go out on a banging song and there's a sense of community and everybody sort of says, hey, you know, we're here together. Now pick up your litter, right? That would be the moment together, right?
Well, funnily enough as well, there was a tour in America that we've done, countless times, Warped Tour, and they actually had a litter picking like initiative. And so maybe, you know, the thing lasts about 8 weeks or something. And like for one day a week, your band would be called to be on litter picking duty that day. So at the end of the day, your band and crew would just go around the site picking up litter. And I love that, because it's that kind of, it's just like, there's no bullshit. It's like, we're all on the same level. Like the bands should be out there picking up the litter as well. Like,
well, I think that, you know, that's exactly the point, isn't it? There's the real danger that you're standing up on stage, getting in your limo and heading off and say, pick up the litter, please. And that must be something, you know, something you must have experienced in your musical career, is how that connection with the fans has changed in the last decade, right? I mean, partly it's a business thing, because social media says, you know, communicate with your fans. Don't just be the lone figure standing on stage, coming and going in the limousine. So I think do you feel a responsibility there, that this is something, sounds like you do. I mean, that, you know, you can use the power that you have as the front man of a band, but by communing with people, not sort of lecturing people.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the way we kind of evolved as a band was through like a very DIY focused hardcore punk scene. So it was all about a community. There was almost like, there were bands, but you were more part of a community, and that included the audience as well. So that having that very clear and obvious ability to communicate, you know, from band to audience and back and forth, for us is just like, that's the default. That we've never really known anything different. And obviously we've toured with bands or played festivals where, you know, we've watched Metallica or you know, whoever's headlining a big festival go straight off all into individual limos, all into individual airports probably, and back home. And but yeah, it's I think for us and for a lot of bands of our generation and who are coming up now, it really is a community. That's how you look at it.
Yeah, but you know, maybe it really is just changing social attitudes. Actually, you know, James mentions, for instance, you know, at the Rugby World Cup, Japan's fans all took bin bags along and cleared the stadium after every match. You know, if I'm at a dinner party, I posit that if I, you know, basically say, "Do you have any panda?" people are probably going to react pretty annoyedly, you know, because you know it's an incomprehensible thing. You know, but there are a lot of things that people do on a daily basis, you know, that are also, you know, very, very destructive. You know, just for, you know, our relationship with the environment, but they're not yet judged socially. And perhaps that's where things really begin to change, is people like yourself, Rou, you know, who continue to take the work of people like Mark and Hayley, you know, and, you know, transmit it to audiences and, you know, kind of, I guess, make people feel something, which is where we began this wonderful conversation on, you know, it's not just the knowledge, it's provoking people to action through emotional responses as well. So on behalf of everybody who's joined us today online, on behalf of Space Rocks, well, I have to say thank you so much to Rou and to Hayley for spending this wonderful time with us. If we could start the Anthropocene on such a positive note, I think we'll probably end it on an even better state than we're in now, to put things mildly. But thanks for your time, and we hope to see you again very soon. And before you go,
we
have a tradition.
Well, we would love to, neither of you have been involved in any of our live events. So when we do go back live again, hopefully whenever, let's say 2021, of course, we'd love to have you both there and, communing with it, because the one great thing about Space Rocks is in the short time it's been around, we have developed this family, I think, and it's not just, it's very much a place where people get to talk to each other and share and not just turn up in limos. Tim Peake, when he came to the last event we did in London last September, when he left, he said, "Where's the nearest tube station?" And he walked off, and that was him. He went off to the tube on foot. So probably freaked out a few people on the tube when he was doing that, but yeah, so we'd love to have you along. But yeah, we finish, and Hayley's probably remembers exactly what we do. So we have a little bit of a thing at the end to a little hand signal. So we do two things: space and rocks. This is the test of people being able to do the Vulcan salute, and for me being able to center in the camera.
I can only do it with one hand.
And Alex is still, his thumb is edging slowly outwards. It's been weeks, but so thank you very much both for taking part. For you, Hayley, the second time, and we'd love to see you again, Rou. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Great to chat to you all.
And thanks to everyone who watched today. We'll see you around very soon.